And there it is. There's our announcement to get started. So welcome to the Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice, Time to Act Mental Health Echo. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'll take a minute and put your name and contact information into the chat, as well as renaming your profile so we can know who's on our call and get to know each other in this virtual world. We are recording today's session. They are stored on our Canvas page as well as our web page. So you are always free to go back and review the information. If you're like me, it takes me a couple of times to digest what is being said. So I love going back and just reviewing those or sharing them out with my colleagues. We hope that Echo is an interactive way to get to know each other. If we were all here in person in this room, we'd all be chit-chatting and trying to network. And so that's really what this Echo is for as well. So please put your questions or your comments into chat. We have one of our amazing hub members, Kurt Phillips, that monitors the chat for us. So he will make sure that your comments and questions get shared. We do talk about some sensitive topics, so please remember to protect those individual privacy. De-identify the situations or examples. If you have any questions about whether or not you need to de-identify, you can reach out to one of our hub members. They all have an asterisk in front of their name, so they're easier to find in the chat. If you've never joined a Echo session, welcome. We are glad that you're joining our network. We always have a didactic speaker, as well as then we do a case presentation where the presenter is looking for ideas from you guys to hear all of your amazing resources and recommendations. If you've not ever done a case presentation and you have a client or a family that you would just like some more information and resources, please consider submitting a case. I've done cases a few times and I love getting them because we get like 20 million resources that then I can take back to the family that I'm working with. So it's an amazing way to get some more information. Zoom, we've all been on here for a minute, but if you'll just rename your profile, turn on your camera if you feel comfortable and are not eating lunch, it just is a way to build that professional networking and get to know each other. Raising your hand, again, you can do that, put it in chat. We will monitor, meaning Kurt, will monitor the chat for us. You can always pre-register and get some weekly announcements or join our newsletter, and you can do that by emailing timetoact@usu.edu. Throughout today's session, we will be dropping in a survey link. That is how we send out our certificate of attendance. And we really thank you all for filling out those surveys. They are a way that we can take this information back to our funders and keep these resources free of charge to everybody. So we thank you and really appreciate that you complete those surveys. Canvas is where we store all of our information. So if you would like access to our Canvas page, you can email us and just put Canvas registration request in the subject line and we'll get you on there. Just another plug for case studies. They really are one of the most amazing ways to hear from everybody on the call, different resources and feedback to then take back with the families and providers that we work with. We do have a social media that we share information about, that we promote our sessions. So if you've not done so, take a minute to follow us. I am going to stop sharing and turn the time over to Ilse, who is going to give us another another amazing presentation today.
Thanks so much. Let me find those slides. And here we go. And the presenter mode. Okay. There we go. So yes, welcome everyone again. And I was here last month as well. So some of you may have been here also a month ago. But today we have a different topic. So today, last time I focused on perinatal mental health. So basically mostly the mothers. And today we will be focusing on stressed families with an emphasis on the developing child. But yeah, looking more at those families, how social determinants of health impact families and child development, and how we can actually strengthen families through protective factors. So the first part is going to be more about the risks and the things that may be difficult for families. And then the second part will be about what can we do and have a positive message. So my name is Ilse Dekoeyer. I work currently for the United Way of Utah County, have worked there for a year about full time, but I've worked for Help Me Grow, the program Help Me Grow that's under United Way of Utah County since 2015. I also still teach a little bit at the University of Utah as an adjunct, which I did as a full-time job before. And also, I almost forgot to add this, but I'm also still a part of the Utah Association for Infant Mental Health, which is a volunteer nonprofit organization. And I wanted to share that we will be having our annual conference in February. So it will be the first Thursday and Friday of February, as usual. And we'll do 2 half days on Zoom. And Janelle offered generously to share that information when we have the announcement, the official announcement. I do not yet have the link, but I will share that. And I'm very excited for that because the first day, actually both days, we have 2 very highly recognized researchers in the field of early attachment and parent-child relationships. Dr. Beatrice Beebe, she does this very microanalytic coding, which means that she looks at microsecond by microsecond by microsecond change between the expressions of the parent, mostly the mother, and the infant, and how they coordinate, like that dance between the two, when there are challenges as well, like intergenerational trauma. And then Dr. Mary Dozier, she is also working more specifically with attachment and created an intervention for that. And she has mostly worked with foster children, and she will talk about how that impacts their stress regulation and their relationships, how they relate, and then how this intervention helps with that. And so that actually relates to my topic of today, which is about those impacts of social determinants of health. So families and all of us, we seem to be under ever increasing stress. The American Psychological Association in, I think, 2018 did, they do every year, they do a survey on stress in America. And that year, I think in 2018, they surveyed parents and they found increasing levels of stress among parents even before the pandemic happened. And now we've had that pandemic, we've had, economic challenges, rising costs, childcare challenges, housing challenges, so many things. And families are systems. In a lot of research, we've only looked at maybe one parent and one child, but families are whole systems. And what happens in one part impacts all the other parts. So if, for instance, a parent has a stressful event happening at their work, they come home, they might still be stressed, and that stress will impact the other members of the family. Also positive things, if there's a birthday, then the whole family might feel that joy and celebrate together. So they impact one another. And also our nervous systems respond to each other. I'll mention this a little later in the presentation, but even without words, we read each other's nervous system signals all the time. And humans are built that way because to keep ourselves safe, we had to know, is this safe or is it danger? So if, for instance, way back in the past, we were on outside on a plain area, and one person saw a dangerous animal approaching. So if that person started to look afraid with their emotional expression in their face and maybe make a sound like, every one of the other people would respond to that so that everyone could get to safety. And we are still built that way. So we are very quick in picking up signals of either stress or safety in another person's nervous system, particularly when you're a child and you're looking at your parent, because children look at their parents to know whether a situation is safe or not safe. And so the way that children develop, all of their developmental processes are embedded within these systems, both dyadic in the immediate parent-child relationship, the one with mom, the one with dad, the one with grandparent, maybe, and also in the whole system. And in turn, families are also embedded in the multiple other systems in society, like your workplace, the childcare center, the educational systems, the neighborhoods, and your culture, as you know, and that's also historic. So let's look at those social determinants of health first. And you probably have all heard of it already. This is the definition by the CDC. They define it as the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. They are the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age. And those systems and forces, they shape daily life. They also impact one another. And they include large scale things like economic policies and bigger economic, health policies impacting families, like paid leave or no paid leave, or impacting childcare, etc. And the CDC is using this broad model of these 5 different categories. So how people are impacted by their health and healthcare systems, by their community contexts, the educational systems, the economic stability, and neighborhoods that they live in. And this is just a way of categorizing because there's many different social determinants of health. And this is a list that the World Health Organization has created. And they include also early childhood development as a social determinant of health, because we know that what happens in early development when the nervous system and the whole body is still developing, and our understanding of the world is developing, and our understanding of relationships is developing, that's when risk factors have the biggest impact. And so that's what I'm going to mostly focus on today. But just in general, research shows that social determinants of health can be more important than healthcare or lifestyle choices in influencing health. I've got this slide later on, but I think all of you have probably heard by now about that research study by Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstad, who is at BYU and who did her PhD here at the University of Utah, who found that it is less healthy or has more impact on our mortality to have poor social relationships than to smoke 15 cigarettes a day. So we used to think, just eat healthy, go to the doctor, exercise, do those things, and you'll be healthy. But we have found that social and economic circumstances are very impactful on our health and even mortality. And again, development is embedded within so many systems, which includes the biological systems, as well as those bigger factors that I just mentioned. And humans, within all of this, stress that we may experience in all of these different circumstances, humans are very adaptable. But some circumstances, of course, are harder to adapt to than others. And also some groups in our society have had more challenges historically to adapt. And so this impacts generation upon generation. And babies are born. When they're born into these social, economic, historical circumstances, and it will impact their health too, even prenatally that begins to develop, even actually before they're conceived, the health of their parents has an impact on the health of that infant. And I wanted to start with the big picture. and the big economic circumstances that impact families. So this is these are two graphs that are on income inequality. And you can see that this is in this one over here on the left is data from 2021. Income inequality has been growing and growing. And in 2014, with the Infant Mental Health Association, we showed this documentary called The Raising of America. I don't know if any of you has seen The Raising of America. That was in 2014, and they already showed these types of inequalities and how it impacts families' day-to-day life. But the inequalities have even grown bigger, so that the top 1% of the population earns, I don't even know how big that number is, more than $3 million. And then the rest of us has a lot less to divide amongst ourselves. And on top of that, the paychecks have, so basically the bottom 90% is the orange. And then the very bottoms, okay, no, actually that, sorry. The 90% is this very flat, low income that has not changed. And these other ones are the richest people that have gotten more and more. So having less money to divide amongst the majority of people has had the most impact on people of color, people of different ethnicities. And that's shown in these two. So people of all ethnicities and races experience poverty, unfortunately, but the proportions are higher in people of color. And amongst those, children are the poorest of all. So looking at straight poverty levels, 16% in 2022 was considered poor of all children, compared to 12.6% of the overall population of all ages. And again, mostly in children of color, but also the youngest children, babies, toddlers. And of course, we know that single mothers, if there is a separation or divorce, the mothers end up with lower finances. And then also children in the south of the United States, where there is a lot of intergenerational poverty and racial and ethnic disparities as well. And they found that between 2020 and 2021, the number of children living in poverty actually went down. And that must have been related to the stimulus checks and the child tax credits. But then on the other hand, other children who weren't poor before now were poor. So there's been some shifts, but it's still an issue. And the good news for us in Utah, I know not all of you are in Utah, but if you are, the child poverty in Utah was actually the lowest in the nation at 8.4%. But if you not only look at the very lowest poverty level, but at the low income, which is defined here in 2021 as about 55,000 for a family of 4, then we have about 1/3 of babies living in those low income families. As well, a significant amount of families lives with low food insecurity, housing instability, as well as lack of insurance for those babies and toddlers. And then poverty in itself is often considered to be the biggest risk factor for families and child development, because it impacts so many other things, like all of the things on the list over here. And it increases chances of all of these concerns, like physical health concerns, and even into having more health problems in middle age and having a higher chance of dying sooner when you are growing up in poverty as a child. Then for child development, children who live in poverty, they experience less language in their environment, and they tend to be behind in language. I have actually this little slide by research by Dr. Anne Fernald, who has a very interesting TED Talk on this phenomenon that shows that even by 18 months, we can see that the economically disadvantaged children are behind in vocabulary compared to the more economically advantaged. And so this also relates to challenges with school and academic functioning, even lower IQ. I used to think IQ was inborn and genetic, but IQ is actually impacted in large part by poverty and other risk factors. It also increases chances of insecure attachments, behavioral concerns, and mental health concerns as a child develops, and less optimal brain development as well. And I think, oh, maybe I didn't put a slide in here, but you may have heard of these different programs that have tried to actually give cash, just to give money to those very high risk moms who are pregnant, and then during this period of time, or also into sometimes early childhood. And they do find that adding some income reduces a lot of these risks. So a lot of it, it's very complex, but just adding some money and resources actually does help those children's development. And this is from 2006, but since there's many other studies that do keep finding the same, that young children with family risk factors relating to substance abuse, maternal depression, or domestic violence, which are also social determinants of health, are 2 to 3 times more likely than children without these family risk circumstances to experience aggression, anxiety, depression, and hyperactivity. This one was done a little more recently in 2016 and looked at young children over time, and they found that when they compared poor and non-poor children, then the ones who were poor were more at risk for higher physical aggression, higher hyperactivity, and higher oppositional behaviors. And as they grew older, the physical aggression differences remained the same, even though that, with age that decreases, as you probably know. It's normal for a 2-year-old to hit someone, but by age 5, they are learning to use their words and other methods. But looking at hyperactivity and oppositional behaviors, the poor children became increasingly more hyperactive and more oppositional when the non-poor children reduced those behaviors over time. Now, this study is really interesting, I think. It's called Linked Lives because they found when the mother's lives changed, the children's behaviors changed. So, for example, when a divorce happened, then they saw an increase in behavioral problems in the children during that time that just happened. When there was persistent poverty, then the concerns about aggression and oppositional behaviors, they were worsened. But when moms escaped from poverty in that young childhood period, then the children were no more likely to have conduct problems than those who were never poor. So again, there is hope, because if we can help change circumstances and uplift families, we can actually change the trajectories for these children. This study looked at ACEs, so also considered social determinants of health. So these are the adverse childhood experiences, and these children were very young. But when they experienced a lot of ACEs, they were likely 3 times more likely to have behavioral problems when they were 9. And it was most challenging to actually have intermittent adversity. So at each of these ages, they could have more or less adversity. And the idea here is that if your life keeps changing, there's, it seems to be more stable, and there's another stressor coming up, and there's another trauma factor coming in. That is the most challenging for adapting, because you never know what to expect. And so that increases behavioral problems the most for young children. Stress, of course, can come from many factors, not just poverty. And I mentioned a few already, the ACEs, for instance. And it matters at what age we expose children to stress. Also, there are individual differences. Some people are just more sensitive to environmental input and stress. And I don't know if you guys have heard of the orchid hypothesis. I'm not really talking about that in this presentation, but the idea of the orchid hypothesis is that some people are more like an orchid. We also call them highly sensitive people, or people with a sensitive temperament. But these are people who respond very strongly to environmental things, like when they experience bullying as a child, or when they experience something that someone else might think is minor, actually. They react more strongly. However, they also are more open to positive influences as well. So that's the good news. But if it's severe trauma, like severe bullying or maltreatment, of course, everybody is impacted. So still, it matters. Like, for instance, with maltreatment in a little bit older children around age 8, if the child thinks that they were responsible for being maltreated or for domestic violence between their parents, that child is much more likely to then develop anxiety and depression symptoms when they think it was their fault, as opposed to children who knew it was not their fault. During pregnancy, high levels of stress impact development. It impacts birth, so it increases chances of premature birth or low birth weight, as well as delays in infancy. And then also, this is actually way into adolescence, problems with attention and emotion regulation, and higher risk for chronic illnesses, immune disorders, and poor health, and unhealthy lifestyles as well. And this is because during the prenatal period, our entire nervous system is building. And if the nervous system response system, like the release of cortisol with the HPA axis, it is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is being formed prenatally, may respond much more quickly by releasing cortisol when the child is already prenatally stressed. Now, stress during pregnancy is completely normal. So, don't think that, there's no one probably that has no stress at all. But I'm talking about severe stress or severe anxiety or depression. And these impacts from even the prenatal period, if it impacts the nervous system in that way, can even continue to the next generation. Now, you guys have all heard of this. This has been, I don't know how long ago this was, at least 10 years, probably more. Yeah, more than 10 years ago. The Harvard Center for the Developing Child created this distinction between different types of stress. And so we can have stress that's actually positive. We can stress that's tolerable. And the bad kind of stress is the toxic stress. So when you encounter some sort of everyday situation that's frustrating, like a child builds a block tower and it falls over, and they try to do it again and it doesn't work, or they try to build with their Legos and it just doesn't work, they get frustrated. And this is normal. This is normal when you're trying to learn something that's just beyond your reach, which is, the zone of proximal development, which is essential to learn new things, is to try things that are hard. And so that stress, that slightly elevated heart rate and elevated stress hormones are used to then generate energy to try other responses and other solutions. And these experiences also help children know that when stress is rising in those moments, it will also come back down. So it's actually good to have positive stress, because you learn, like, I get so stressed and it's so difficult, but I'm calming down again and everything's okay. So that's a really helpful experience for our nervous system to learn. Now, sometimes the stressors are much more serious, like one of your parents is hospitalized, or a grandparent dies, or there's a natural disaster, which we are having more and more of, it seems. And in this case, there is actual stress. The adults are probably also stressed. But if the adults can so-called buffer the stress by showing to the baby or the young child, you're fine, I've got your back, I'm here for you, I'm creating a safe environment for you, a safe routine, your bedroom is safe, you can sleep safely. Adults can buffer this stress. If the child's sad, they can comfort the child and give space for these emotions. And in this case, the physiological reactions will probably be stronger or maybe a little longer, but they will also calm down. And the child will learn that even when some really bad things happen, I can find someone who's safe, people will help me, and my nervous system will calm down eventually. And buffering, really what that means is that the stress response is still activated, but the bad effects of things like cortisol exposure are less or actually not happen at all. So prolonged exposure of cortisol to our bodies, it impacts our entire stress system. Our immune systems can be impacted by stress that's continuing. But if we have this kind of soothing, comforting experience, then our bodies can calm down from that. And then toxic stress is that situation where the stress is ongoing, it's not letting up, it's frequent. It could also be unpredictable, like a parent who can burst out in anger at any moment. But what's different about this is that, first of all, it is severe stress, but also it is stress that does not have a resolution. So there's not that person that can help you calm down from it or reassure you everything is going to be okay. And this can actually impact the child's brain architecture, their immune system functioning, and leads to like chronic inflammation. So that's causing health issues, physical and mental health into adulthood. And that's the one we're most concerned about. And of course, child maltreatment is a huge one in this category. And sadly, as you can see here, the youngest children, babies, are the most at risk. And this is mostly from neglect, but even neglect has a severe impact on children's development, specifically their brain development, which tends to stay smaller, and the children are less cognitively engaged and less able to learn. So that's concerning, of course, and it's an ongoing issue, unfortunately. When children have that experience of being maltreated, they start to view themselves and their relationships differently. They have attachment problems. Typically, they tend to, they can self-blame, like I said. Not all of them do it, but a lot of them do. And then it can come with low self-esteem and trouble creating healthy relationships. Of course, also trouble with emotion regulation, and then during childhood or after childhood, mental health concerns like anxiety, depression, and aggression is typically more in, shows up earlier, but yeah, all of these can occur. And then stressed children become stressed adults. And when these children become parents, they can break cycles, of course, but oftentimes what happens is their bodies are still primed to be very responsive to stress, or to have different patterns of stress responsivity. And when you have had a lot of stress as a child, this increases the chances that you are more stressed during pregnancy. Again, not everyone does, and we can create different patterns. So, and actually, pregnancy is an excellent time to start creating new patterns, like practicing relaxation, finding your social support systems, and finding ways to help with that emotion regulation. But it's a challenge. It's more challenging when you have had a lot of stress, especially toxic stress experience as a child. Again, not all parents, some are able to create those secure attachments, but there is a higher likelihood if you had an insecure attachment pattern that you also will have an insecure attachment pattern with your own children. And then with regards to brain development, the amygdala that responds really strongly to emotions, including fear and aggression, and the prefrontal cortex that helps us to plan and organize and have executive functioning, that connection is less strong in children who have been abused. So that means that if you haven't learned other patterns into your adulthood, then you may be more likely to lose it and to not be able to contain yourself or to regulate yourself. and to use those executive functioning skills to regulate. So we can certainly support those skills in parents, but parents that have experienced these things may need more support than others to learn different patterns. Also, organizing team, please keep track of time. It's always good to give me a reminder if I am close to time, because it's hard to keep track when I'm talking. But next, I wanted to share a little bit about different ways that people deal with stress. And this is based on the polyvagal theory by Dr. Stephen Porges. I'll put everything, I think, on the slide so that you could see all three. But basically, these are similar to what animals do and then our evolutionary past. So I'll actually start at the bottom. If we can, we will use social engagement to regulate that distress. So when a baby cries, and the parent is close and the parent picks up the baby and rocks them and goes like, oh, you're sad, and by hearing the voice and that rocking and feeling the warmth of that parent, that baby can calm down in that social engagement pattern. And when the baby's calm enough, then they will start to use social engagement signals like looking and smiling. And when we're a little older, we can use social engagement as a first strategy when we are upset. So we can be like, hey, I want to talk to you. I don't feel so good. Can we talk? Or it could be positive emotions like having lots of excitement and kind of needing to downregulate that. But we can laugh together. And so use that social engagement to help us regulate our emotions. But when the stress or the load becomes too high, then we might move into a fight or flight pattern where we're like, now I'm getting really upset. The talking doesn't help. The relationships don't help. And so I need to mobilize, I need to get away, or I need to, fight. And of course, young children, they might literally do that. Older individuals might not actually do that, but still feel that in their bodies, those hormones coming in and those patterns of higher heart rate and wanting to just, mobilize. And then when stress becomes even higher, and especially if these two other strategies didn't work, we can move into freezing or fainting and immobilizing, slowing down our heart rates. And that is more similar to like a mouse that plays dead or a reptile. And that's when all else fails. And this actually can be more common in infants. For example, those who have a disorganized attachment pattern, because infants may not be able to fight or flee, and they don't have the social engagement skills yet. And so again, when these patterns occur early in development, that may impact how you regulate stress as you grow. But the good news is that supportive, responsive relationships with caring adults as early as possible can prevent the damaging effects of the toxic stress. And there's hope. So now we're moving into the section that is more hopeful, which will talk about the 5 protective factors. So, and I like to have that balancing scale because, of course, what we want to do is to put more protective factors into that, like make that way heavier than the risk factors so that the protective factors can help to balance out the negative effects of those risk factors. So these are the 5 protective factors. There are many more, like we can make a whole long list of protective factors, but these are 5 categories of protective factors as created by the Center for the Study of Social Policy, CSSP. They put this together because these are research-based ways to help families reduce child maltreatment risk and improve parenting and child development. So first of all, concrete support in times of need. So we used to think of that only as those very neediest families, but we actually need to acknowledge that all of us need help sometimes. Like, I don't know, it's just, if I go on a trip, I need someone to take care of my cats. That's just some concrete support, or, any family might need therapy at some point. So there's all kinds of support that we may need, and certainly when we're parents. Of course, when we have those highest risk families that I just talked about, those have the highest needs, and they also will need the most support. And some of the skills that you need, if you're a parent or not, but most of these, but certainly if you're a parent, you need to be able to ask for help. And I say that, and I know I have a hard time with that. I'm guessing many of you may have a hard time with that, but that's the first thing, is to actually acknowledge, hey, I need some help. I know there's help out there, and I'm going to find it. Also being open to help, because we can actually have people who want to support us, but we may not see that they want to help us, or we may not even accept their help. And if you work with parents, that's one of the more difficult situations, is when you do have resources, you do have help, but they're not open to it. Also knowing about the resources, what exists out there, as well as advocating. So in a situation where a child has a developmental delay or disability, and you need an IEP or a 504 plan in school, and maybe the school's not listening, then you need to advocate and say, like, hey, my child has these specific needs, and we agreed, that you would provide this and this and this. So that's a really important skill, as well as being persistent, because sometimes the systems are not very open to immediately helping us. Now, luckily, there is help. There are lots of great resources. And of course, in the United States, you can call 211. I put the little logo here of the United Ways of Utah. So we have multiple 211 centers. We have one in Salt Lake. We have one in Provo, in our Utah County United Way. And we can connect families to resources from 211, all kinds, like if you need mental health support, housing support, job searches, yeah, all kinds of help. Call 211 and they will find you what you need. Then since a couple of years, we have this suicide and crisis line 988, which is excellent to have that when people are in emotional crisis or have suicidal thoughts. That's the resource to call. For mental health concerns with children, Intermountain has a great line called ARCS, which is Assessment, Referral, and Consultation Services. And this number, they will first, of course, look at their own Intermountain resources, but if your insurance does not fit their resources, then they also know of other resources to refer to as well. And Help Me Grow Utah, of course, I'm biased, but Help Me Grow is just a wonderful connection to connect families to resources, families with young children. And I'll show you a little more on this slide. So we have a wonderful team that informs parents about all kinds of child development and parenting information. We do that in English and Spanish. And we focus on families that are expecting a baby or have a child from 0 to 8. And they can take, between ages 0 and 5, they can take developmental screeners and ages and stages questionnaires, as well as the MCHAT to screen for autism risk. And we also offer the Edinburgh postpartum depression screening for perinatal parents, mostly the moms that are pregnant, and then also after. We've had a few dads that took it, and they can, but it's mostly moms. And we will follow up with them and be empathetic with their situation and find them support groups and whatever else helps them. The parent support specialists, they stay with the same family. So there's this relationship that is built over time. It's all on the phone, but it's very meaningful to have that person check in with you and care about you and find you the resources that you need. And then our outreach team, this is the connection here in the circle. They connect with other organizations all around the families so we can together serve their needs. So the next protective factor is knowledge of parenting and child development. And of course, all parents need to know, why does my child do that? When is my child going to develop, these different skills? How do I support my child? And there's so much information out there these days that it's hard to know what is good information. So how can we help parents to find reliable information that's research-based when there's, TikTok and all these other social media channels and all of these parenting books, which can be overwhelming for parents and frankly increase anxiety because they might be afraid that they're missing out on the best method. So, this is what we do to help me grow, and it's just all experts, of course, recommend start with where the parent is at and see what they already know, what they've already tried, and what they need. Some things that I think are always good to support, especially related to mental health, this is the mental health echo, is to support that secure attachment. The circle of security is my favorite resource on that because it has the graphic, and it just makes it so beautifully clear that children seek security and comfort, and when they feel secure, they go out to explore and go out on the circle, and they come back again to the attachment figure. Emotional regulation is also essential for mental health, as well as to reduce behavior problems and relationship issues. And so one good one is the emotion coaching model by John Gottman. Stress regulation. So there's emotional regulation and then there's stress regulation. The window of tolerance is a good one, and that's mostly used with adults, where you notice when I go too high, I'm getting more into that fight or flight. When I go too low, I'm getting more into that freezing state. And in between, I can manage. And then also parent-child relationships more broadly. So again, we'll have presentations on that with UAIM in February, but we want to always support the positive way that parents can interact with their children and also pick up on how their emotional expressions and their stress has an impact back on their child. And when the parent can slow down and really be present with their child, the child can then express themselves, express any concerns, express any emotions that they might need to get out of their system. And we love to recommend special time, which is where you set a timer for maybe 10 minutes. The child can choose what you do together, and you're just really there to just support that child as sort of a newscaster, like, oh, you're putting this, this little guy in the car, and oh my gosh, the car goes so fast. And you're not trying to make the child go calmer or steer the play or have them learn their ABCs. You're just present with that child. Also, some essential things to teach about too are screen time, which of course has come up so fast that I think we as professionals are kind of sometimes slow to give information on that. And then the importance of routines for that stability, that security, and it helps the whole family to be more connected as well when you have family routines. And I wanted to remind you here that even under severe stress, we can buffer that stress by having those safe, secure relationships. And that's why I wanted to emphasize that in the knowledge of parenting and child development. Also, I wanted to note that it can be challenging especially when what we want to teach families is opposed to what they think they want or need or what they value. And a big example here is physical discipline. Some people's families have grown up receiving physical discipline, and those parents may want to do that with their own children. Certain cultures may value physical discipline more or be more used to it and think it's the best way to discipline. So we may need to, first, again, listen to the families, listen to the parents, meet them where they're at. And then hopefully when we can make this connection, we can help explain what the effects of physical discipline can be, and that's typically not the best, and then offer alternatives for that. So we may encounter parents who have different values. We may have parents that have a lot of social determinants of health challenges in their lives, like economic ones, or housing and things like that. And then also we may have possible patterns of intergenerational trauma, where when you look at that parent, imagine what they might have been like as a child when they might have had their own developmental trauma. So we want to, of course, support the research-based information, and a model that I really like. I don't know if you guys have, some of you will probably have gone through the FAN training. So it's facilitating attuned interactions. And one thing that they emphasize is to always start with where the parents at and always listen first, empathize first, and then have some collaborative problem solving. What would work for them, and then how can your child development expertise help them? And then the drops of knowledge are to not give too much information all at once, but just tiny bits of information so that they can process it and then ask you more questions, hopefully, about it. Related to all of this is fostering the social emotional competence of children, because if they can recognize their emotions, communicate how they feel, mommy, I'm scared, instead of starting to hit or whatever, then we can help the child to regulate those emotions in a more advanced way, in a more verbal way, and help them to do it more and more on their own, independently. And it also helps them to create positive relationships for themselves. And of course, this depends on the child's age, how that will look, how we foster the emotional regulation. In general, we begin to co-regulate. So first, the adult is the one who regulates that child's emotions, and then more and more independently, the child can do it. It may also depend on culture. So for instance, the United States culture in general tends to be more verbal. We did research in the past with Dr. Fogel, and we observed families from a Latin American background and families from Anglo-American background. And we found that the Latin American background moms, they sat much closer to their babies. The babies were closer to the moms. There was more physical touch. And research has found that especially United States white families, they tend to focus much more on verbal communication on a distance. But either way is fine. It just fits the culture. And it also lays the groundwork, to do this not only for their current development, but also for their later mental health and relationships. So
I am going to ask if you would wrap up just so that we can get to that case presentation.
Okay, thank you, Janelle. And I'm going to skip this slide, but I'm going to want to talk about every one of these. There's only two more, I think. So social connections, that's the biggest protective factor of all. And it's not so important how many relationships you have, but the quality. Because if you have parents that are surrounded by toxic relationships, for instance, that's not going to help them. This is that slide I mentioned before, and you can look at it later when I share my slides about how social connections are more important for health than smoking or other health-connected things. And what we want to do is we want to help parents to support those relationships. And they may already have people in their community, like family, that's willing to help, but they may not have asked for that help yet. So we may need to remind them, maybe a church group can help you, or a parent group, and help them connect to that. Social support can buffer stress. And so again, I'm going to go through this quickly, but basically what this slide says is that moms could be equally stressed and even have cortisol in their system, but it did not impact them as much if they felt supported by their partners. The last protective factor is parental resilience. And that has been defined in many, many different ways, but we really focus here on when there are all these adversities and stressors and potential trauma, how can a parent manage stress specifically in order to still parent the child with what the child needs? So the parent can still be super stressed, and we want them to also be connected and supported as well, so that they can be a resource for their child. And it doesn't mean that we're immune to stress or trauma, but we are now, if we can foster resilience, we can be empowered to find solutions. It's extremely important to foster this because also low parental resilience and problems with dysregulation can increase chances of child abuse. And also it dysregulates the child when the parent freaks out. The child is more likely to also freak out if there's no regulated adult. And parents also just deserve to be happy and to do things that they love, and at the same time feel well equipped to be a parent. So I would always start with asking what works for you. And there's many things that have been supported by research, like mindfulness or exercise classes, or just self-care in general, like reading a book, taking a bath. And how can we help parents to do that for themselves? I shared this link here that are audio recordings to mindfulness exercises specifically for parents and specifically focusing on self-compassion, because parents can be very strict with themselves, and we want to support that what they're doing is good enough. So to conclude, social determinants of health can significantly impact child development as well as family well-being. The stressors impact the body and the stress responses that can be carried on into the next generation. But luckily, we can increase those protective factors and reduce the ill effects of these risk factors. And we always want to meet these parents with compassion, understanding that they're doing their best. They may have different values and beliefs, but we want to implement those protective factors in ways that work for them. And lastly, don't forget to also work on your own protective factors for your own self, because we also need to be resilient and have our own connections and knowledge and everything that we need. The most important tool that we have, that you have to work with families, is you. And so take good care of yourself, and thank you for your attention.
Oh my gosh, that was amazing. So I'm going to open it up to comments, but I just need to say thank you. I loved how you tied all this kind of together about how it impacts that child development, because that's really some of our everyday work. I also love that study on the social interactions. I put a little comment into chat for Kurt, because I always give him static about team building, and you kind of emphasize why it's important to do that team building. We need that. So I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I'm going to open it up for comments really fast or questions before we move on to our case study.
I had a quick question, Ilse. On one of the studies that you mentioned, you talked about poverty and the effects they saw when there was a change in the parent circumstances on the child, and the improvement that we saw. And one of the things that kind of struck me is a lot of those behaviors, or a lot of those symptoms that we see in those kids, have a lot of correlation with the diagnoses that we see for a lot of the mood disorders, or a lot of the behavior disorders that we see kids diagnosed with, particularly around those age ranges. So one of the questions that I had is, is that an implication for some of those kids for misdiagnosis if we change the environment those kids are in?
Well, that's a great question. So you're basically asking, for instance, if the circumstances changed and the family became more stable, then would that child maybe not have been diagnosed with ADHD or something? Or
correct. Or, maybe that's not, maybe the ADHD still is there, but the severity is not what it would have been otherwise, or we see an improvement. Maybe we're looking at more of a provisional diagnosis when we improve the environment of the kid or the child in the home, stability, more consistency, less stress in the parents, then we actually see an improvement in the child because we have more consistency in that and a better home environment. So then we're seeing better functionality in the child. So really we're diagnosing the child instead of diagnosing the home.
Yeah, diagnosis, it's a big topic. So we can't, give the final answer to that. But I can tell you for sure that even if there is or might be a diagnosis, that having that more positive parenting will reduce the symptoms. But in some cases, it can help to have a diagnosis. So, you know, if it is ADHD, that can sometimes help parents to have more compassion or understanding, and then still implement those more positive parenting strategies. And I think what that one study said is that if parents have more stress due to economic or other factors, they are not as able usually to give that positive experience and to, you know, help reduce those behaviors because the parents themselves are stressed. But yeah, that's a great question. And
so I guess to me, the implication to me is, so as a whole, as you know, a social support system and agencies, should we be looking at more than just the child and the diagnosis, and working more with medical and mental health agencies when we're looking at kids and diagnosis to support the family and the home better, and looking at the bigger picture, I guess is what I'm getting at, using that research and information more effectively.
I 100% agree with that we need to do that. Yes, it's a whole system around the child, and we need to, yeah, it's not just the child.
Great. Well, thank you. I am going to move right on over to our case presentation. This one was submitted to us, and this is another way to present a case if you're not comfortable in sharing it. So I'm just going to talk about it. Sarah is a middle-aged mom of 8 kids. There's still 6 in the home. They range from 4 years to 21 years old. Her oldest son and youngest son, 21 and 4, are both on the autism spectrum. The family is going through some big life changes. Mom's previously been homeschooling the children, and the source of income is a family business. Dad worked out of the home for 5 days a week, the entire 22 years of marriage. Mom and dad separated 8 months ago, and mom has filed for divorce after many years of long-standing emotional control and abuse to both her and the older children. Currently, the parents are in a nesting situation. Mom and dad do not communicate well, and the divorce is contentious. The mental health of the family is definitely being tried. The older children are angry and alienated from mom by the dad. The 4-year-old is confused and struggling at school to adapt to his new preschool, and he refuses to use the potty at school. The only daughter in the family, who's 15, seems to be questioning her gender and has started to dress masculine, cut her hair, and wants to be referred to as a male name. This started before the divorce was announced. She relates well to mom, but has avoided dad. The daughter seems to be mildly depressed, but insists she's okay. Mom has talked to mental health professionals about her and to her pediatrician as well. All of the children are now attending public school. 3 have qualified for an IEP for learning disabilities related to reading and math. And the children are social and friendly, appear to enjoy school, and are making friends. Mom has started to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. Dad's shut down the construction business and is taking lower paying jobs. So that's an overall view of what's happening with this family. There's 3 questions that this individual wants us to see if we have any recommendations. Is 1, how can mom and dad support the children when a child is unwilling to go to counseling, specifically the 15-year-old daughter? What resources might be available to mom who is juggling employment while taking care of the kids? And what are the pros and cons of having sole custody 50-50? So Shayna has broken us up into breakout groups, and I can't remember what you did. She's just put it into chat. So hub members, if you'll take those notes, and we will come back at about 1:25 from breakout groups.